I've never been one to run away from my problems, but after the breakup with Jack, I needed time to breathe. I found a secluded cabin in the countryside, the kind of place where no one could find you unless you wanted them to. It was perfect, or at least it seemed that way. The first letter showed up 2 days after I arrived. It was on the porch, carefully placed on the railing. I thought it might be from a friendly neighbor, but the message sent a chill down my spine. You look so beautiful when you get lost in thought on the porch. I froze for a moment. Who could have written that? The cabin was miles away from any other house. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been passing by and saw me from a distance. Someone strange. I locked the door that night, feeling a bit silly but uneasy. The next day, another letter was there. This time, the message was more intimate. I know what happened with Jack. He didn't deserve you. My heart raced. How did this person know about Jack? And why did it feel like they were watching me? I spent the day searching the area around the cabin, looking for footprints or signs of someone nearby. All I found were strange symbols carved into some of the trees. They looked like runes or something, but I had no idea what they meant. As the days went by, the letters kept coming. Each one more specific, more invasive. Details about my life no one should know. The handwriting seemed almost familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things and got into my car, but the engine wouldn't start. I checked the gas tank. It was empty, even though I'd filled it before coming. Someone had drained my car. When I went back inside the cabin, there was another letter waiting on the kitchen table. You can't leave, Kate. Not yet. The reality that I was being watched the entire time hit me like a punch to the gut. I locked all the doors and windows, but it didn't make me feel safer. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and completely at the mercy of whoever was out there. That night, the symbols on the trees began to glow faintly, as if something had activated them. The sound of footsteps on the porch made me freeze. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and waited, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped, but then a whisper began. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like multiple voices speaking at once. Then I heard something else, my name, spoken clearly in the middle of the whispers. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I ran to the bedroom and locked the door, spending the entire night wide awake with the whispers echoing through the cabin. The next morning, the letters were gone, but the symbols on the trees had multiplied, forming a pattern around the cabin. I knew that if I didn't leave soon, something worse was going to happen. I used whatever I could to improvise fuel for the car, cooking oil, anything that might work. I managed to get the engine started and drove away. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and swear I saw a figure standing on the porch, watching me leave. To this day, I still have nightmares about that place. I never found out who wrote the letters or what those symbols meant. All I know is that something in that cabin didn't want me to leave alive. After I finally made it back to the city, I felt safe for a while, but that didn't last long. A few days later, I found an envelope in my apartment mailbox. The handwriting on the front was identical to the letters I'd received at the cabin. Inside was a single message. You may have escaped, but never forget, Kate. I will always find you. My heart nearly stopped. How did they know where I lived? I was sure no one had followed me to or from the cabin. After that, I started noticing small signs that I wasn't alone. Things in my apartment felt out of place, as though someone had been there. Some nights, I'd wake up with the unshakable feeling of being watched. Once I heard footsteps outside my window in the middle of the night, but when I looked, no one was there. I changed apartments, jobs, and even cities trying to escape, but nothing seemed to work. Every time I thought I was safe, another letter would appear. The messages grew more sinister over time, warning me to stop running. Now, I try to convince myself it was all a delusion, a reaction to the stress of the breakup and the isolation. But deep down, I know it wasn't. There's no logical explanation for what happened in that cabin or for what continues to haunt me. Sometimes I still dream of those glowing symbols on the trees and wake up with the overwhelming sense that someone is in my room. I don't know what it means or how it all started, but I know one thing for sure: this isn't over. I didn't know what to expect when I moved to that town. After years of living in the hustle and bustle of the big city, I felt I needed a break. I rented a simple house on the outskirts of a small rural town where life seemed slower, quieter, and more peaceful. The first few weeks were a relief. I was finally getting used to the silence and calm of the place. But soon, things started to spiral out of control. At first, everything seemed normal, until I started noticing the strange behavior of the neighbors. They were extremely welcoming, maybe too much so. Forced smiles, conversations that always seemed to have something hidden beneath the surface. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. The strangest part began when my phone started receiving strange messages. At first, they were just random numbers and disconnected words, but then it got worse. I started getting messages that seemed to come from nowhere. No sender, no explanation. The first one that sent chills down my spine read, "We know where you are." At first, I thought it was a prank or a wrong number, but the text began to intensify. One afternoon, my car was found parked in a place I had no memory of visiting, and I hadn't even left the house that day. I knew something was seriously wrong, but I couldn't imagine what it could be. I tried to ignore the signs, convincing myself it was all in my head. But then one night, while I was trying to sleep, something strange happened. A knock at the door. I walked to the entrance, and when I opened it, there was no one there, just an intense cold in the air, as if the warmth had been suddenly drained from the environment. That cold, I'll never forget it. I quickly shut the door, a chill running down my spine, and went back to the living room. But when I looked out the window, I saw one of my neighbors, Mr. Harper, standing in the middle of the street just staring at me. He didn't do anything, just stared. I don't know how long he stood there, but time seemed to stretch. When he finally turned and walked away, fear had already taken hold of me. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. In the days that followed, I started noticing things escalating further. The townsfolk began acting even stranger. Every move I made seemed to be watched. Every word I said seemed to be recorded. When I went to the market, some villagers approached me, asking questions that didn't make sense about my family, my past life. They knew things about me that I had never told anyone. Realizing this, I began to feel paranoid. What was happening in that town? What did they want from me? At the local shop, the cashier, an elderly woman named Agnes, told me I should stay calm, as if she knew exactly what was going on. It was the first time someone had spoken to me so directly about it, and my blood ran cold. The day after that strange conversation with Agnes, I grew increasingly restless. I decided I needed to know more about the town's history. Something was very wrong here. Out of curiosity, I went to the basement of the house I had rented. The house already had an eerie vibe, but the basement, with its damp, moldy walls, gave me chills just thinking about going down there. Even so, when I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was watching me, I gathered my courage. Downstairs, the first thing I noticed was a strong smell of aged wood and something else, something undefinable, as if time itself had been trapped in that place. Among some dusty boxes and old furniture, I found something that made my blood run cold, a deteriorated leather-bound journal. The name, written in faded ink, was James Morgan, and it was dated over 30 years ago. The first page of the journal was filled with mundane notes about James's day-to-day life in the town. But soon the tone shifted. He began writing about how the neighbors were becoming increasingly strange, developing an inexplicable obsession with him. At first, it seemed harmless, small visits, a few words, but then he started documenting what felt like stalking. James wrote about how he felt like some of the townsfolk were always following him, always watching him from a distance. He mentioned how some even approached him with empty gazes and strange smiles, as if there was something hidden behind their behavior. As the journal continued, James's writing grew more disturbing. He described the people in the town as mad, as if something was controlling them from within. He didn't understand it, but he knew something was deeply wrong. He even noted instances of people mysteriously disappearing, people he knew who had vanished without a trace. James realized that the town carried on as if nothing had happened, and he began to suspect he might be next. The later entries in the journal became increasingly erratic, as if he was writing under immense pressure. One sentence in particular made me stop breathing. "They're coming for me. I need to leave. If you're reading this, know there's no escape." The last page was blank. That moment, fear consumed me entirely. I knew I had uncovered something far more sinister than I could have imagined. I tried to set the journal aside, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. What else was happening in this town? Who else knew about it? And most terrifyingly, who else had fallen under the control of this invisible force? That night, I couldn't sleep. James's story replayed in my mind, and every sound in the house made me jump. I was convinced the town had something to do with the disappearances and that the neighbors were involved somehow. When night fell again, I decided I had to dig deeper. But as I walked down the hallway, an eerie feeling washed over me. I knew I was being watched, but when I looked out the window, no one was there, just the empty street and trees swaying gently in the wind. The next morning, I went to the local market. I tried talking to the owner, Frank, but he seemed uneasy around me, almost like he was avoiding eye contact. When I asked him about the town, the residents, and the disappearances, his reply was simple and unsettling. "It happens all the time, kid. The important thing is people come back. That's just how it is here. It's part of life." He smiled, but his eyes were cold and empty, as if he knew something I didn't, something he didn't want me to know. As I walked home, the air felt different. The street was deserted, the neighbors were all inside, and no one would look at me. When I entered the house and shut the door behind me, I took a deep breath. I knew something was closing in, something I couldn't avoid. James's journal had made one thing clear. There was no way out. The town had already swallowed me whole, and I was just another resident waiting to be consumed by the strange, invisible force that controlled everything here. That night, lying in bed, the tension was unbearable. I heard footsteps on the stairs, but no one was there. The walls seemed to whisper my name, and the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. I knew I could no longer trust anyone in the town, and the last thought before I drifted into a restless sleep was that James might have been the only one to escape. But even he knew there was no real way out. I knew it too now. I was trapped. The next morning, I woke up with the distinct feeling that the entire town was against me. The pressure was suffocating, as though the very streets and buildings were closing in around me. The whispers from the walls grew louder, a constant murmur that felt like something or someone was trying to communicate, to drag me into the darkness hidden within the town. James's journal haunted my thoughts, and the fear that his fate awaited me pushed me into action. I couldn't wait any longer. I didn't want to find out what would happen if I spent another night in that house, in that cursed town. I knew it would only get worse, and if I stayed, I would end up like all the others, vanishing without a trace. I got out of bed, my mind set, and began gathering my belongings. I packed only the essentials into my backpack and hurried to my car. Every step felt rushed, desperate. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew I couldn't stay, not 1 second longer. As I threw my things into the car, the feeling of being watched didn't let up. I could sense the neighbors' eyes on me, even though no one was visibly outside. It was as if they were all hidden in their homes, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't afford to linger. I wasn't going to stick around to see what the town's next move would be, or who might vanish next. The thought of being their next victim, caught in their strange protective rituals, was enough to make me slam the car door and start the engine. I sped down the road, determined to leave the town as quickly as possible. I didn't look back, not even once. The road stretched endlessly before me, but as I put more distance between myself and the town, a strange weight began to lift from my chest. The suffocating sense of being watched lessened with each mile until it faded entirely. I knew I'd made the right decision, though a part of me remained on edge, as if some dark force might still be following me. At that moment, all I wanted was to escape. I left the town behind, and with it, the fear, or so I thought. I never went back, and I never sought out what became of that place. I just moved on because one thing was clear. My life mattered more than any secret that town held. I never imagined that a simple retreat to escape the pressures of work would turn into something so disturbing. I, Maya, had rented an isolated cabin near the beach, hoping to find tranquility, but instead I found something that haunts me to this day. When I arrived, the landscape was breathtaking. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks, the fresh sea breeze, the sun setting on the horizon. At first, it was perfect. I spent the first few days enjoying the peace, but soon, something began to unsettle me. It was one of those nights after having dinner alone on the porch that I saw the first figures in the distance, walking along the shoreline. What disturbed me most wasn't the sight itself, but the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. The strange part was that no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see a single sign of life nearby. Who were those figures? I wanted to ignore it and chalk it up to exhaustion or the isolation, but I couldn't. In the following days, I tried to stick to my usual routine, but the appearances became more frequent. They showed up after nightfall as the shadows consumed the beach. They looked like people, or at least they seemed to, but there was something wrong with them. Their movements were erratic, as if they were being pulled by an invisible force. My throat tightened every time I saw them, and the unease grew with each passing night. One night, I couldn't take it anymore and went to the nearest village. I told one of the locals what I had seen, and their response was far from reassuring. They told me the beach had a dark past, riddled with mysterious disappearances over the years, and that many believed something strange inhabited those waters. That was enough to frighten me, but my curiosity won out. I had to know what was happening. I decided to investigate further, despite my growing fear. I went to the small local library and found old newspaper clippings about people who had disappeared on the beach without a trace. Most of the disappearances happened at night and the bodies were never found. Some villagers whispered about an ancient ritual, something involving the sea, but no one dared to elaborate further. Each new account filled me with a sense of dread. I felt trapped, with no idea how to escape. The thought that those figures on the beach might be connected to the disappearances tormented me, but something compelled me to keep digging. It was as if I were being drawn toward the truth, as if the sea itself had something to reveal to me. On an especially quiet night, when the sea breeze was colder and the sky clear, I decided to follow the figures. I felt as if I were being watched, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking across the sand toward those distant silhouettes. They were always moving, but I couldn't make out their faces or forms clearly. As I got closer, something strange happened. The feeling that my surroundings were changing became impossible to ignore. The sand beneath my feet felt heavier, and the sound of the waves seemed farther away, as if the sea itself were retreating from me. When I finally got close to the figures, I froze. They weren't human. The shapes I had seen were indistinct and shadowy, but now, as the flashlight illuminated them, I realized they had no features. They were like shadows moving in a disjointed dance. A deep chill ran down my spine. I stood paralyzed, unsure of what to do. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't comprehend what. The figures began to move toward me, their undefined forms swaying as if made of mist. I felt the cold air against my skin, and the sound of the waves faded further, replaced by an oppressive, muffled silence. Panic consumed me, but I couldn't move. They drew closer, and then one of them, or perhaps it was one of them, broke formation slightly. It was just enough for me to see something in its eyes, a strange glow, something that shouldn't have been there. A cold, empty light, as if the essence of life had been stripped away. I couldn't bear to look, but I couldn't look away. Something held me there, as if the place had turned into a force field, and I was just a puppet. Finally, a stronger breeze swept through, and the figures began to disappear. The sand beneath my feet lightened, the sound of the waves returned, and I managed with great effort to step back. I stumbled and ran without looking back. When I reached the cabin, it felt as if time had shifted. The sky was overcast and the cold wind had intensified. I locked every window and door, but something inside me knew it wouldn't matter. Feeling that they were still there, waiting, didn't leave me for a second. I couldn't sleep, and fear seeped into every thought. When I looked out the window the next morning, the beach was empty, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew those figures weren't from our reality, and the truth, whatever it was chasing me, waiting for the right moment to fully reveal itself. I decided I couldn't stay another day. I packed my things in a hurry, avoiding the windows and the view of the beach. As I loaded my bags into the car, something made me stop. There were marks in the sand, footprints that looked human, but had a strange spacing, as if something enormous and clumsy had passed by. They led from the shoreline straight to the cabin's entrance, stopping right at the door. My heart pounded and my blood ran cold. Instinct told me to get in the car and leave, but something, a morbid curiosity perhaps, made me glance back one last time. The footprints were slowly being erased by the sea breeze, but not before I noticed one thing. They weren't fresh. They looked as if they had been there for a long time, preserved in the sand despite the waves and wind. It was as if the environment itself had kept them intact on purpose. I got into the car, my heart in my throat, and drove as fast as I could, feeling something watching me with every mile. I didn't stop until I reached a main road, far enough away that I couldn't smell the salt or hear the waves. Even now, days later, I still feel that presence, as if something followed me. And when I close my eyes at night, I swear I hear footsteps, always starting at the end of the hallway and moving toward my bed.